With any luck, there will be a relative cessation of noise outside, we never know, but we will carry on, no matter what they do. We'll walk out here, and I really do thank everyone for coming. At this, the 32nd year of the English Department's Visiting Writers Series. I'm going to give you some relatively unemotional, factual, actual facts about our visitor today, Susan Perabo. It's kind of backwards in the way I usually introduce somebody, but I'm hoping that this ass-backward form will prime me to be a little less corny and a little less unabashedly emotional when I get to why I'm so especially pleased she's with us today, but we'll have to see how that works out. When I was hired by this department in 1985, a major part of my charge was to develop and organize a sensible creative writing emphasis for English majors, to make for less haphazard creative writing and for more substantial writing, along with coherent plans for worthwhile and even more important, necessary reading. This, of course, would require students who would then make it their business to dig in with both gusto and some distinct self-discipline. But before I carry on there, let me tell you those facts. Susan Perabo is the author of 2 story collections, Who I Was Supposed to Be and Why They Run the Way They Do, and a novel, The Broken Places. Her fiction's been anthologized in Best American Short Stories, Pushcart Prize Stories, New Stories of the South, Stories of the Universe, anywhere they're collecting stories. This woman's stories have appeared, and in numerous magazines as well. A much anticipated novel that's getting, this is a word poets don't usually get to say, a lot of buzz. A novel called The Fall of Lisa Bello will be published this coming March from Simon & Schuster. She is currently the writer-in-residence and professor of creative writing at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and serves on the faculty of Queen's University Low Residency MFA program in Charlotte, North Carolina. Okay, now it's a little dicey. This reading is a homecoming of sorts. Susan was a 1989 Webster University graduate in creative writing. And now it gets a little dicier still. Having that charge to create this sensible or coherent creative writing program, needing a couple of students who would be willing to dig in, who weren't just going to sit around and say, I write to express myself. I write to get my feelings. I write to exorcise my demons. I write to many, many creative writhing propositions there. Happily, there were a few such students, even in those very earliest days. And I mean it when I say that no student was any more up for that kind of work and the attendant rigor that I wanted to insist on than Susan. This is after we stole her away from her once upon a time intended major in film, as often happens. We get refugees and outright kidnappings. She proceeded to soak up everything available to her in this neck of the woods, drama, poetry, fiction, but she was a deliberate, a passionate reader. All writers are readers first. Passion. To be passionate about what somebody else has written may be the only chance you ever have if you serendipitously or calculatedly decide, I'd like to do some of this sometime. If your work is to have that effect on somebody else. And boy, was she a reader. So while this is happening, I could see it happening. She was falling hardest for fiction. She's called on the record somewhere Raymond Carver, her first literary boyfriend. I don't even get her started on Flannery O'Connor, kicking in a little later. Early teachers, both. And it's another thing that will always be true of any writer worth their salt. Best teachers you can have are not the people at that table in there or in the room in here, but are those writers who get you going. Those are the people that you learn from as well. Early on, teachers, more and more. A reader and a reader, her deep-seated curiosity and growing self-confidence, which she has occasionally admitted in retrospect, I think the word was cockiness, but confidence is a thin line, made for an absolutely invigorating mix, both in and out of the classroom. She was thoughtfully moody, she was whip smart, she was funny, and she was quick. And funny and quick are not necessarily the same thing, though there's overlap. She was engaging, yes, but engaged, and they are not the same. In real life and in her stories. And in this spacious territory that I was lucky enough to be around, where the two of those things, the life and the stories, that territory where the two of those became increasingly more wonderfully indistinguishable, each from the other. To this day, one of my biggest pleasures reading a Perabo story or a novel is the sense that the writer has disappeared. That's the ultimate magic of good writing. I don't want to see how the writer put together this, made this fit, smoothed this into there. When I read Susan's stories, I'm hearing people talking to me, to each other, from the narrator to the characters that populate those stories. She's aptly described her stories at another time as a collision between experience and imagination. She was asked about the proudest accomplishment as a writer in some one of these interviews that certainly follow you around. She said, I know it sounds strange, but I'm proud that I'm still writing. There's so much else to do, so many distractions, and I feel really fortunate that I continue to get enough satisfaction simply from the act of writing itself, that I make room for it in my life. I still get amazed that anyone beside my mother reads my work, but even if no one read it, I would still do the work. Writing doesn't just happen, and she knew this at the age of 18. It needs to be accounted for. It needs to be actively accommodated. She would so much rather write, this was true then and certainly true now, than be a writer. Those are two different things. Good writing makes for an actual honest day's work. It's hard work for sure, but it's too ridiculously easy merely to be a writer. You just declare yourself one and you're done. 10-4, over and out. So just who was she supposed to be? Paraphrase an early title. A filmmaker? Sorry about that. The first woman to play NCAA college baseball. I swore I'd be the only person in America talking about Perabo that did not mention the fact that yes, indeed, she was, because Webster had no softball team. A woman loved baseball. And so she played. That she was commemorated for it, at least for a while, in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Swore I was going to say that, so you didn't hear it here. Subsequently, a beloved professor, check. Short story maker, check. Novelist, check. Check again. Frost said that other people, readers, are the ones who should call you writer if you've earned it. And this woman surely has. This is what she was supposed to be all along, and who she so genuinely is. And it is my great pleasure today to give you my friend, Susan Perabo, writer.
I don't think I'm going to read. I'm just going to send you all home after that. Thank you. I cannot possibly top that. Wow. Thank you so much. As much as he says, it's the teachers are the people that you read. The teachers are also the people who are at that table. And I sat at that table almost 30 years ago with David for 3 or 4 semesters, and he taught me how to write, and he taught me how to be a writer, and he taught me the difference between those two things. And that because I was here, I'm here. Really, it's that simple, and I'll never forget that. And that's why it's so wonderful to be able to come back here and stand in this room and read to all of you. Also, thanks, in addition to thanks to David, thanks to Murray and the class I talked with last night. Wonderful and good people and good, thoughtful writers and readers, and it's great to see that tradition continue here. So I feel very, very fortunate to be able to come back and stand up here. More than I can say. I'm reading actually from this novel, The Fall of Lisa Bello, that comes out in March. I'm going to read a chapter, an early chapter from it, and I'm just going to give you about a 30-second introduction to that chapter. The chapter that I'm reading is actually a flashback from the present action of the novel. It takes place about 10 years before the present action. And in the present action of the novel, Lisa Bello, from the title, and our main character, Meredith Oliver, are, at the beginning of the novel, involved in an armed robbery in which Lisa is abducted and Meredith is not. And the novel, in its present action, follows Meredith's journey after that crime, and also the journey of her mother, who is trying to deal with what has happened and what has not happened to her daughter. The second chapter of the book is from the mother's point of view, and again, it takes place about 10 years before the abduction, which is the plot of the novel. When Meredith was a toddler, her big brother Evan was a jubilant first grader. Young Evan was so jubilant that the first criticism ever leveled at him by a teacher was that he literally whistled while he worked. This had come in kindergarten, just after he'd mastered the skill and was determined to share it with the world. He sat in his miniature chair at his miniature desk in his cheerful sunlit classroom, coloring numbers and letters and dinosaurs and trees and trains, and whistling. He couldn't stop whistling. His closest neighbors, the others in the rectangle cluster of miniature chairs and miniature desks, could not concentrate. How to Stay in the Lines when the boy beside you whistles his way through the entire Lion King soundtrack. Claire and Mark had laughed over this after the initial report at the parent-teacher conference. "We've clearly failed," they said. "Our child is too happy." In spirit only, they exchanged exuberant high fives for having co-created a perfect child. And look, there was another co-creation, 4 years younger than the first, but every bit as perfect. But one afternoon the next year, when Claire went to collect Evan from school, the first grade teacher pulled her aside in the main lobby and reported in a hushed voice that some of the other boys in class had been teasing Evan about his weight. His weight? Claire shifted 2-year-old Meredith to her other hip. Meredith was a squirrely toddler, rarely content to be in one position for more than about 15 seconds. Claire knew if she put Meredith down in the school lobby, chaos would ensue. "What about his weight?" she asked. It had never occurred to Claire that Evan's weight might make him a target because she had never considered him fat. She had seen plenty of fat kids in her exam rooms. Most of them had a mouthful of cavities to go along with their rolling stomachs. Evan was nothing like that. Evan was big, like Mark. He'd been a big baby and a big toddler, and now he was a big 6-year-old, more round than straight. It wasn't his diet, it was his body type. Mark had looked the same in childhood photos. Darling, thriving, not fat. Evan didn't eat candy or drink soda, and he was always running around, and one of the boys called him a porker, the teacher whispered. She was a new teacher, no more than a year from undergrad, and she actually blushed when she said the word. It did sound obscene, Claire thought, especially coming out of the mouth of an adult. Like it couldn't help but have a sexual connotation, but the fact that it didn't in this context made it seem somehow even more revolting. Then it caught on, the teacher said, and a few boys started doing it. Has he been upset at home? Claire put Meredith down but kept a firm grip on her hand. When would he have been upset at home? She asked. When did this happen? The teacher smiled, a pity smile, Claire recognized, at bouncing Evan, who was leaping from red square to black square on the lobby's gleaming tiled floor, much to the amusement of his sister, who was attempting to twist her sweaty hand free from Claire's fingers so that she could join her brother. "Evan," Meredith said. She said this 1,000 times every day. "Evan, Evan, Evan." The halls were empty now, and the slap of his sneakers echoed in the stairwell above. "It started last week," the teacher said. "I've spoken to the boys about it privately, but there's one in particular who won't let it go." "Last week?" Claire said. She let Meredith go. It was like letting a puppy off a leash, her daughter around the corner and down a hallway and out of sight in seconds, Evan trailing behind. "It started last week and you're just telling me now?" "We try to let the kids work these things out on their own," the teacher said, standing a little straighter. "If we involve the parents every time someone gets called a name..." She trailed off, leaving Claire to assume the rest of the sentence, in which she and every other attentive parent in the world was tried and convicted. Claire realized that in the space of 2 minutes she had unwittingly become that kind of parent, And it wasn't even fair. She'd asked only a single question, expressed an entirely justifiable moment of surprise, and now she imagined she was flagged, probably forever, before she'd even had a chance to decide what kind of parent she wanted to be in this new world with these new rules. Really, I just wanted you to be aware, the teacher said. Generally, we believe in awareness, not intervention. Hey, great motto, Claire thought. Students, teachers, parents, take note. Awareness is now sufficient. An actual response, not necessary. Why act on what you know when knowing is considered enough? Meredith and Evan had wound their way back around to the front doors, so Claire took the opportunity to escape, muttered a thank you to the teacher over her shoulder as she caught up with her children. In the parking lot, in the minivan, she held out for about 45 seconds before asking Evan about the situation. Don't worry about it, he said. He was sitting in a booster seat beside Meredith, who was strapped into her car seat and beaming at him, fresh off her puppy run, basking in the glorious light cast by her big brother. This was how it always was, and Claire had tried to accept the fact that except for when Meredith was looking at Evan, for whom she had always saved her very best smiles, happy had never been Meredith's default emotion. Baby Evan usually had a smile on his face, but baby Meredith's go-to expression had normally been one of consternation and or suspicion. Creased forehead, narrowed eyes, pursed lips. It was as if she were always waiting to be put down in her crib, anticipating it, whereas with Evan it had been a daily surprise. This place? Again? Honey, she said to her son. Really, don't worry about it, he said again. He was playing a handheld video game, a car-only treat, and he didn't even bother to look up from the screen. Of course I'm going to worry about it, she said, watching him in the rearview mirror. It's not nice. Doesn't it make you feel bad? Yeah, he said absently, still not raising his head. But it's okay. The game beeped and buzzed. Did he even know what he was saying? Was he even part of this conversation? He adored his electronic games. If they'd let him, he might have played all day. But they didn't let him, of course. He exercised regularly. He played baseball with the neighborhood kids practically every afternoon. He was an active child. A porker? Ha, hardly. She'd show those kids a porker. She'd seen a kid in the grocery store last week stuffing his face with free samples while his mother, incidentally, also a porker, stood by and watched with a big fat smile on her face. She'd bring that fat kid in for a fat show and tell. You want to see a real porker? She'd ask the class. She was going 38 miles per hour in the school zone. Okay, Jesus, what was wrong with her? She took a breath, eased off the accelerator. She was shocked by her own capacity for cruelty. The little boy in the grocery store had a name, a story, she reminded herself. She was ashamed, and she didn't even know where the rage had come from so suddenly. Of course, it wasn't the fact that Evan was not actually a porker that made the bullying unacceptable. It was terrible to call someone fat if they were actually fat, and yet to call someone fat who wasn't, she somehow couldn't get past this particular element of the injustice. It just seemed wrong on a whole other level. Evan, she said, it's not okay, honey. It's not okay at all. It's mean and awful to call people names. I think I should talk to someone about it. What? No, he exclaimed, horrified enough to look up from his game and meet her eyes in the mirror. Don't worry about it, okay? There's nothing you can do. Full stop. It was a good thing, perhaps, that their eyes only met in the mirror, that it was only his reflection that spoke, that she was not looking into her child's face directly when he said this. Her eyes slipped back to the street in front of her just as something crawled over her skin, something unfamiliar, something slimy and cold that surely belonged at the bottom of the ocean. In less than a second, it had her covered from head to toe, and then it started squeezing. So this was the world that existed for her 6-year-old son. This was it. A place where things could make him feel bad and absolutely nothing could be done about it. A place where she was powerless to protect him. At 6, he had somehow already reached the conclusion, independently, somewhere within the walls of that elementary school, the elementary school where he had whistled just last year, while she at home and at the office had cheerfully and blindly persisted in her belief that she had at least a modicum of control over the things in the world that could harm him. She wasn't a fool, but really was a modicum too much to ask? Meredith was clamoring for his attention. He was looking at his game. The game had swallowed him. Meredith was dying for attention. Evan, frantically smacking her hand on the side of her car seat. A group of kids darted out from behind some parked cars, and Claire braked hard, probably harder than she needed to, and she and Evan and Meredith lurched forward. "Sorry," one of the kids yelled, looking back guiltily, but another of them was laughing. A dog was barking in a nearby yard. "Evan, Evan, Evan," Meredith insisted. "Evan, for God's sake, acknowledge your sister," Claire shouted. In all the ways that Claire knew mattered most, she had lived a charmed life. She was fortunate, and she'd been taught from a young age to appreciate that good fortune. She was not one who went blithely through childhood and adolescence, taking everything for granted, forgetting that it was a luxury to have 3 square meals and a room of her own and a shiny bicycle in the garage. She was an only child, and her parents, who had both been in their 30s when she was born, had constructed their middle age around her. They were both teachers. Her father taught high school English, her mother middle school social studies, until Claire was born, and then her mother left full-time work and became a substitute teacher so that she could be a full-time mother. Home had always been a safe zone, and if her father occasionally drank too much, and if her mother sunk low and occasionally spent the morning in bed after Claire left for school, it was all forgiven and forgotten between them when she walked through the door in the afternoon. "You were the glue," her mother told her a couple months before she died. "You have always been the glue." Claire wasn't sure how she felt about this. Glue in the sense of simply being a force that tightly bonds, or glue in the sense of the necessary element in fixing something broken. It seemed too late to ask her mother this question, unfair to bring up something, anything, that couldn't be satisfactorily resolved in a half an hour. That went against all the unwritten conventions of conversing with the dying. No one wanted to end on a sour note. The final days lingered on for months. Every conversation might have been their last conversation, but wasn't, until it was. It was cancer that killed her mother when Claire was 27, before Evan and Meredith were born. It was the same year her marriage ran into trouble. She knew this was unfairly euphemistic, designed to not assign blame, where in truth the only one to blame was herself. So all those emotions were tangled up together. Her father remarried quickly just over a year after her mother died, and she recalled being struck by the injustice of this, that a replacement wife could be attained so quickly and with relative ease, while a replacement mother was not even an option. Of course, she knew this wasn't fair, and that her mother was irreplaceable as a person, as a proper noun, but she clearly wasn't irreplaceable as a common noun. His father once again had a wife, whereas she would never again have a mother. She kept her promise to little Evan. She did not call the first grade teacher and demand names. She did not deluge the principal with frantic emails, in part to prove to them that they had been wrong about her, but also because she genuinely believed that to intervene at that level would only make Evan's life worse. She very much did not want him to be the porker who, by the way, needed his mother to helicopter in and fight his battles for him. But she was ill with fear every time she dropped him off in front of that 2-story brick building with the sloping lawn. A few months before, the place had seemed warm and welcoming and full of light, and now it was as if she were pitching him headlong into a jungle whose predators she could not even begin to imagine. And he, her sweet and beautiful Evan, who had been the center of her world, her only child for so long, was defenseless against them. She began to look at all the other children in his class with suspicion. That little blonde with the shirts that said "Daddy's Girl" and "Princess in Training." The lanky kid, tall as a 4th grader, who flung himself down the front stairs, limbs flailing. The redhead with the Eagles backpack who always ignored and then openly sneered at the crossing guard. "Who's that?" she asked Evan one day, a couple weeks after the porker incident, as they were driving home from school. "Logan Boone," he mumbled. He gets his name on her face and understood it completely for the first time. She wanted to leap out of the van and wipe that look off his face with her fingernails, but she was helpless. He couldn't have been any uglier, this boy now receding in her side view mirror, receding back into the place where he could do anything he wanted, where she could not touch him. "Some kids are just assholes," had been Mark's predictable response when she told him she had positively identified the porker culprit. "Wasn't anybody ever mean to you?" "Not in 1st grade, she said. "They're not supposed to be horrible to each other already. Isn't that what middle school's for?" "It's a different world," Mark said, shrugging. "Everything's changed. Our kids are going to have cell phones when they're 10. "Our kids are not going to have cell phones when they're 10, she said. "Absolutely not." All I'm saying is that everything happened sooner, Mark said. The clock sped up. But maybe that means it'll be over sooner, too. Maybe by the time they're 15, they've already lived through all the crap we had to deal with until we were 19. Do you really think so? She asked. I don't know, he said. We can hope. He could hope. That was the thing. Mark could always hope. It was a permanent condition, like freckles or lupus. Mr. Glass Half Full, she sometimes called him, though they both knew that 90% of the time she did not mean this as a term of endearment. Everyone loved Mark, and why not? He was lovable. What you saw was what you got. Nothing lurked under the surface. She knew some people thought he was a phony. Her own mother had thought that for a long time, that his English chatting away to patients was an act, his friendliness to strangers insincere, but it was all maddeningly genuine, every bit of it. Blessed with impeccable chemical balance, Mark took pleasure in things without questioning why he was taking pleasure in them. On weekends, when the kids were little, she and Mark would have their friends over, other couples with young children, and the men would set up Mark's movie projector and sit in lounge chairs in the backyard, drinking beer and watching James Bond movies on the side of the garden shed, while the women sat on the patio talking about their babies and their jobs and complaining about those men in the lounge chairs. And inevitably, one of the women, they were all divorced now, every single one of those couples, a 100% divorce rate among those early friends. One of the women would say, but then there's Mark. This was always followed by resigned sighs, then several minutes of tipsy, joking, not joking envy, and then finally a group PowerPoint presentation minus the slides, detailing several great things about Mark. He separates whites and colors. He took the kids to the doctor without her. He compliments her new haircut. And later, after all the friends had left, Claire would look at him through their eyes, swept up in his star power, thrilled anew that she possessed him, and the night would inevitably end with them wrapped together in bed and him saying, we should definitely have those people over more often. So he was great, yes, in all sorts of ways, but his fathering motto, we can hope, had never been much help, and in fact was becoming increasingly useless with every passing year. It was, to Claire, once the wolves were at the door, nothing short of infuriating. Would her mother have been useful then, after the honeymoon period of Evan whistling and baby Meredith beaming at her whistling brother? Would her mother have had wisdom to impart? Her mother had always had an uncanny, sturdy sense of perspective. Not a judgment that diminished you for what you were feeling, but just the right questions to wrap the world into a clearer focus long enough for you to see your issue in its proper place. Sometimes she tried to conjure up her mother and imagine what she would say. Certainly she would not applaud Claire's hysterical rage, but Claire did not have her gift, her mother's gift, for perspective, and so she couldn't recreate what her mother would say, or at least not how she would say it, and bring herself any clarity or relief. Her mother had become a shadowy figure to her. By then, almost a decade gone, the list of things her mother had missed was as long as the things she had not missed, and the listing was too sad, the conjuring not only unhelpful, but also depressing. So Claire put those thoughts aside. She had to focus on her children. She had to change the game. She had been spoiled by her own happiness, by Evan's happiness, by the family's happiness, allowed herself to believe that raising children would be more pleasure than pain. She had simply been going along, foolishly thinking that she understood the rules. She and Mark had provided for the children. They had a lovely home and a roomy van and a reliable second car. They watched movies and played games and sang songs, and her heart was full, and she had imagined that this would suffice. But she had not counted on the world. How could she have forgotten about the world? Was she so stupid, so naive? If she hoped to survive this motherhood, the word now felt just a tiny bit sinister when she heard it in her head, she would have to change her tactics. 2 months after the Porker incident, after everyone but her had forgotten it, or at the very least moved on from it, she walked into exam room 3 on a dreary Tuesday afternoon to find Logan Boone supine in the chair at the blue paper bib chained around his neck. She actually did a double take. She had seen him so often swaggering down the sidewalk that this was the image of him that had burned itself into her mind, so much so that even in her little indulgent fantasies of confrontation, it was always that school street sidewalk where she faced him down. He looked small in the chair. Everyone did, flattened out like that, a bug on its back. But even horizontal, there were angles in his body that seemed consciously intended to illustrate his superiority. Everything looks fine, the tech said, handing Claire the chart. I'll just take a peek then, Claire said. This was the way it worked. For the standard checkup, the tech did 90% of the work, then Claire or Mark came in at the tail end to confirm that all was well. People expected to see the dentist, if only for a couple minutes at the end of the appointment. They paid $100, or their insurance company had, and they needed FaceTime with someone with a doctor in front of his or her name. Claire sat down on the stool beside Logan Boone and picked up her probe. Open, she said, and he did, without looking at her. She was certain Logan Boone had no idea who she was. His gums were bright pink from cleaning, his teeth smooth and well-spaced. He'd already lost 6 of his baby teeth. Evan had only lost 1. She located the spot where the most recent baby tooth had vacated, it looked like only a few days before, and poked the point of the probe into his tender pink gum. Ah, Logan said, his face twisting. Be still, she said. She readjusted herself on the stool. There's just a little something here. What? Logan asked. She twisted the point into the gum where the new adult tooth was forming, and Logan gasped in pain. His eyes, for a moment, lost their hardness, and there was fear in them. No, Claire thought, it went deeper than that. It was that pleading look, astonishment, confusion, betrayal. Claire often thought that it was precisely this expression that made so many dentists so miserable. A look regularly given to dentists, but almost never to doctors. A frantic look born of pure pain and irrationality. Why are you doing this to me? She saw it all the time, mid-procedure, not only from children, but from adults, people who understood full well the necessity of the work being done on them, being done to them. This, of course, what she was doing to Logan right now, was a different kind of necessity. Got it, she said, looking Logan straight in the eye, just to see if she could. His eyes were thick with tears and his lips were quivering. You big baby, she thought, you pathetic, horrible crybaby. Rinse out, she said. She slept better that night. Her pit and her stomach subsided. There were things that could be done. Perhaps her children were defenseless. Her boy just 7, her girl nearly 3. But she was ready to enter a new phase of parenting. The joy was ending and the battle beginning. At least she, the dentist, had some decent tools with which to fight for them. Thank you.
Thank you again for coming. There are all kinds of things out in the hallway. There are both of Susan's collections of stories here, if you would like to take some Susan home with you. The novel coming this next March. But yeah, our bookstore and our good bookstore person has copies over here. So please feel free to eat and please feel free to pay to bring the book home. Thank you very much.